Hi guys, this is Lauren with Watkins Art, and today I am going to be going over the basics of soft pastels, going over what they are and everything you need to know about getting started with them. So what are soft pastels? Soft pastels are a powdered pigment with a binder added to them to hold them together. The pigments used in soft pastels are the same types of pigments used in watercolors and oil paints. The difference between those mediums is the type of binder being used. With oil paints, you're using a type of oil as the binder. You typically use like a linseed oil or some other type of oil mixed with the pigment until it's smooth and a homogeneous consistency. Watercolors, they usually use gum arabic and oxgall in them to help the pigments stick to the paper and to blend and flow the way that you want them to. If you just use pigments and water without a binder, they would not stick to the paper. So the binder that is used in soft pastels, the most common ones are gum arabic, gum tragacanth, or menthol cellulose. Those are the three main binders used in soft pastels. Once the pigment and the binder have been thoroughly mixed, they are either shaped by hand or by machine into usually rectangular or cylinder shapes and then allowed to dry completely. Once dry, then you use those soft pastels directly on your paper to apply the pigment and to draw. The next question is, what is the difference between soft pastels and oil pastels? Oil pastels have a different binder than soft pastels. So they have a pigment base, but oil pastels, the name gives it away, they are mixed with an oil and wax mixture. So they're kind of like a hybrid between a soft pastel and oil paints. They have a very different texture. They're a lot more creamy. They can feel kind of sticky or damp on your hands. And instead of producing a lot of dust, they can leave little clumps of pigment, but it's not powdery. It's not going to leave like the same kind of chalky feel in your hands. Oil pastels don't blend the same way as soft pastels, and they give a lot different of a look when you are working. I get asked a lot about oil pastels. I haven't worked with them in a long time, and I never really got super into them, so I do not know very much about oil pastels. I will tell you that in this video, whenever I refer to the term pastel, I am referring to soft pastels. So what types of soft pastels are there? There's actually 4 main categories of soft pastels. The first category is your traditional soft pastels. These have a higher portion of pigment and less binder in them, and they are what people traditionally think of when they think of a soft pastel, just a stick form of pigment. These can be formed by hand, and you'll see a lot of them marked as hand-formed or hand-rolled pastels, or they can be shaped using a machine. Within the spectrum, there is variance in how hard or soft these pastels are, and the softer they are, the more crumbly and delicate they might be, but they will deposit pigment more quickly. They can be a cylinder shape or they can be rectangular shape, like this Terry Ludwig soft pastel. The next type of soft pastel is the pan pastel. This pastel has the most pigment and the least amount of binder out of all the options. It has such a small amount of binder to them, and they're such softly compacted types of pastels that they actually can't be in a stick form. They come in these pans, and then you use a tool, like a type of sponge, to apply it to your paper. So instead of applying pigment directly to your paper, like with traditional pastels, you actually use a tool to apply it. This can be a pro or a con, depending on what look you're trying to achieve. I find that the pan pastels are the most finely milled, and you can get some of the smoothest blends with them, but they aren't as opaque as some of the other options, and so you can't cover up mistakes as easily with a pan pastel as you can with traditional pastels. These work really nicely with other mediums though, so you can use them with colored pencils and pastel pencils or charcoal when you desire to. So the third type of soft pastel is called the hard pastel. These have more binder in them and less pigment than the other forms of soft pastels. And they are machine compressed, so they are very hard and they don't deposit color as easily as the other pastels. Some of the advantages of them is they're not as fragile, so they're not going to break apart as easily as a normal soft pastel. They are great for sketching and early layers of a painting. Sometimes they're also called things like new pastels. That's the Prismacolor name for their hard pastels, and I've heard them be called new pastels just as a general term. One thing to keep in mind with these pastels, because they are so hard, if you try to apply them on top of a thick layer of traditional soft pastels, they will just scrape the pastel off that is underneath. So the last type of soft pastel is the pastel pencil. This is just pastel that is in a pencil form, so it's surrounded by wood. These pastels tend to be like a medium to hard range in the hardness scale, so they don't crumble apart, and you can sharpen them to a fine point and you can get lots of really nice detail with them. I didn't sharpen these very well before I filmed, but you can sharpen them to a fine point. These are a great option if you don't like the feel of soft pastels. So I know a lot of people that don't work in soft pastels, even though they love the look of them, because they can't stand that dry texture of the powder from pastels on their hands. If that is you, I would recommend trying pan pastels and pastel pencils together, because those don't deposit as much pigment on your hands. It's a lot cleaner of a method of working, and you can still achieve that beautiful pastel look. So what are the main supplies needed to get started in soft pastels? I am just going to go over the 3 basic things you need to get started in pastels. There's a lot of other things you can use that help make it easier, to help with blending techniques, but we're just going to go over the 3 basic things. You need pastels to start with, you need paper, and you need a rag. That is all you really absolutely need to get started. You just need to pick out what type of pastel you want. You need to pick out a type of paper that will work with the pastels, and a rag. The rag is to help you work in a clean way. Pastels are messy, and your pastels will get dirty from either your hands or from the other pastels next to it. And the pigment that is stuck on your pastels will deposit onto your picture. So if you're drawing a white fluffy cloud and your white pastel has tons of other colors stuck to it, you're going to get those colors transferred onto your picture. So use a rag. So what types of paper do you use or choose when working with soft pastels? There's quite a few options available to you, and I actually recently did a whole video reviewing like 6 different types of soft pastel papers. So the first type of paper you can get is something marketed as soft pastel paper. You'll see it marketed as that at the store. Second, you can use a type of drawing paper. So this is just Strathmore drawing paper. You can use that. You can use cold press watercolor paper. You want it to have a little bit of texture, so the hot press doesn't always work well. And then another option is a type of sanded paper. So this is a 400 grit artist grade sanded paper, but you can use, if you're just getting started, you can use just normal sandpaper you get from the hardware store if you want to experiment and see what types of paper you're using. So today I wanted to focus on the tooth of the paper instead of going over specific brands of soft pastel paper. So you can see I drew 4 examples of what the texture of a paper looks like close up. You can see that the drawing paper has a little bit of bumps to it, but it's very smooth for the most part. Compared to the cold pressed watercolor paper or the sanded paper, it looks almost flat. Well, when you draw with a pastel and you drag it across your paper, all those little bumps collect the pigment and hold it on. So the more bumps it has, the more pastel it can hold and the more layers it can hold. The smoother the paper, the harder it is to deposit pigments on. So if you have a really hard pastel, it might not deposit color onto a really smooth paper. And it won't hold as many layers, and so it will limit how far you can push your picture. So if you want to get a very painterly effect and you want to add lots and lots of layers to your piece, then you will want to have something with a little bit more tooth or texture. If you're just sketching and you're just doing like figure sketches, then a drawing paper will be perfect for you. So just something to keep in mind when you're looking at papers. So now that you know what soft pastels are, how they work, and what basic supplies you need, how do you get started? What should you do? My recommendation is to play and experiment with them. And this is my recommendation when you start pretty much any new medium, is to just play with it, get your hands dirty and try it. Because that's where you're going to start getting comfortable with them and understand how they work and how you interact with them. So I would get a piece of scrap paper. This is just some of that Canson watercolor paper. And I am just practicing making different types of strokes. So I have these Mangayo soft pastels on their side, and I'm just practicing doing broad strokes. And I'm practicing doing different amounts of pressure. So if I use a really light hand, you get a lot more white peeking through. If I do a hard push, or multiple strokes back and forth, then more of that paper gets filled in. So that will affect how you work in the future and what kind of look you want to achieve. I'm going to experiment doing different types of strokes that are on the side. What kind of details can I get with these pastels? Can I get thin, wispy lines that look like grass? Can I get variegated lines that change width as they move along? What can I achieve? How do the pastels interact with each other? So what if I layered the pastels on top of each other? This gets you familiar with how your pastels work and work with each other. This gets you familiar with how your paper handles it. And so if you're experimenting with different types of paper, if you do the same process on different types of paper, you will get very different results. And how you approach a piece on a type of paper will be different than how you approach it on another type of paper. So practicing and experimenting will help you learn this. And it's not really something anyone can fully teach you. I like to just play. I don't like to have any firm goals in mind when I'm just learning something. And you can see I'm just messing around. And this is something I even do now. I've been working in pastels for consistently and professionally for 5 years almost. And this is something I still do with them. If I'm getting kind of burnt out or feeling like I'm in a rut, I'll just get a scrap piece of paper and I will just mess around. It's why I made soft pastel sketchbooks a year or so ago, so that I had a spot that I could just mess around with them and experiment. So I practiced stippling motions, I practiced kind of broad strokes, I practiced kind of keeping them on the sides and doing more controlled broad strokes and layering them with other colors, thin wispy lines. This is all something you need to know to get comfortable with pastels. It also helps you problem solve. When you experiment, you can figure out problems before it starts becoming an issue on your big piece. So that brown pastel had a shiny film around it that made it so the pastel wouldn't deposit color onto my paper. So then I took a piece of sandpaper and scrubbed it off, that shiny film, and then that pastel started working better because it can now deposit color. So that's one of the other benefits of experimenting and playing, is because it allows you to problem solve these issues before they become big frustrations in the future. In addition to seeing what types of strokes you can create with your soft pastels, it's important to experiment with different ways you can blend them. So right now I'm showing you how you can blend pastels directly on the paper using multiple colors. So I'm just scraping or rubbing my pastel back and forth, and then I'm getting another color and I'm doing it just below that, and I'm having in the middle them overlap, and that is blending those pastels together in the middle and making a new color. Another way you can blend is with your finger. This one gets you really messy. It's free and available, and sometimes I blend with my finger still, but I don't do this one very often now because it can leave oil on your finished piece, which can affect with how archival it is, because the oil on your hands can damage the paper over time, especially if you've just put lotion on or something like that on your hand, which would leave even more of that greasy film on your paper. It can also affect how it layers over the top of other pastels. The third way is to blend using just a scrap piece of paper. This creates a look that's kind of in between the other two options. And this is a great way to just quickly blend without getting your hands messy, especially if you want the bottom layer of your picture to be a specific color and you don't want as much white poking through. The paper method, you can blend multiple colors together, you can do single colors. There's a lot of different options with it. A few years ago, I did a video where I went over a bunch of different ways to blend soft pastels, and I will leave a link for that in the corner if you want to check that out. And it goes a lot more in deep detail, and it gives you a lot of different methods for blending pastels to achieve different looks. Today, I just wanted to go over some basic ways that you can blend pastels to get started. And with that, I hope I have given you all the basic information you need to get started in pastels and understand how they work. If you really like this video, please hit the like button. And if you have any questions, please leave them down below. If you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. I will be releasing a lot more soft pastel videos in the future, and if you want to see some right now, I have some in the playlist down below. Have a fantastic week, and I will see you next time.